The Montana winter of 1882 arrived with a vengeance. Snow blanketed the rugged landscape, transforming the foothills into pristine white waves frozen in time. Pines bent under the weight of winter, and the wind carried whispers of those who had not survived such seasons before. Jackson Ridge's timbered ranch house stood like a fortress against the gathering storm. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, disappearing into the darkening sky. Inside, warmth battled shadows, but neither could claim victory over the emptiness that had settled in the home 7 years ago. The pounding at the front door came just as dusk surrendered to night. 3 sharp, desperate strikes followed by silence. Fletcher, the ranch's elderly caretaker, moved to answer, his weathered hand reaching for the latch. At 70, his movements were measured but determined, bones aching with the coming storm. "I'll get it," Jackson called from his study, voice gruff from disuse. The door swung open to reveal Sam Thornton, a local rancher. Snow crusted his beard and hat, his breath coming in panicked clouds. Behind him, his horse stood steaming in the cold, head lowered against the wind. "Doc Ridge," Thornton gasped, using a title Jackson had abandoned years ago. "It's my Emma. The fever's got her bad, burning up something fierce." Jackson's jaw tightened. "I'm not a doctor anymore, Thornton. Haven't been for—" "She's just 8, Doc." Thornton's voice cracked. "Same as your Elizabeth was." The name fell between them like a physical thing. Jackson's face hardened, a mask sliding into place over the raw wound exposed. Fletcher appeared in the hallway behind him. "The girl needs help, Mr. Ridge. Der Peterson from town won't make it through this weather." Jackson stood immobile, snow drifting onto the threshold, melting at his feet. His hands, once steady enough to extract bullets under artillery fire, trembled slightly at his sides. "Please," Thornton whispered. "She's all I have left since Mary passed." Something fractured in Jackson's carefully maintained facade. He turned abruptly, striding to a locked cabinet in his study. The brass key hung on a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt. He hadn't opened that cabinet in 7 years. The wooden box inside was covered in a thin layer of dust. He lifted it with reverence and dread, the weight familiar yet foreign in his hands. "Hitch up the sleigh, Fletcher," he commanded, voice suddenly clear and authoritative. "We'll need the medical supplies from the barn as well." 20 minutes later, they were fighting through the storm, horses struggling against the building blizzard. Jackson sat rigid beside Thornton, the medical box clutched in his lap. His mind was already cataloging possibilities. Influenza, diphtheria, scarlet fever. The Thornton homestead appeared through the swirling snow, a small cabin with light flickering in the windows. Inside, the air was thick with heat and fear. Emma lay on a small bed, her blonde hair dark with sweat, cheeks flushed crimson against pallid skin. Jackson removed his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and approached the bed. For a moment, another face superimposed itself over Emma's. Darker hair, same delicate features, same flush of fever. Elizabeth. His Elizabeth. His hands trembled as he reached for his stethoscope. 7 years earlier, Elizabeth had complained of a sore throat. "Just a cold," he'd assured Caroline, his wife. "She'll be fine by morning." 3 days later, the fever had risen like floodwater, drowning his certainty. Elizabeth's breathing became labored, a rash spreading across her chest. "We need to get her to town," Caroline had pleaded. "I am a doctor," he'd insisted. "I know what I'm doing." By the time he'd admitted his mistake, the blizzard had blocked the roads. By the time the snow cleared enough to attempt the journey, Elizabeth had slipped away, her small hand growing cold in his. Carolyn had left a month later, her parting words a knife he still carried in his heart. "You couldn't stop being the infallible doctor long enough to save our daughter." "Doc?" Thornton's voice pulled Jackson back. With effort, Jackson forced the memories down and focused on the child before him. He placed the stethoscope against Emma's chest, listening to the struggle in her lungs. His fingers found her pulse, counted the rapid beats. "How long has she been like this?" "Started 2 days ago. Thought it was just a cold, but then the fever came on hard last night." Jackson nodded, methodically examining the girl. He opened his medical bag, fingers finding instruments with muscle memory that had never faded. A throat examination revealed the telltale white patches of a bacterial infection. "She has diphtheria," he announced. "We need to clear her airway and reduce the fever." For the next 3 hours, Jackson worked with a focus and precision that had once made him the most sought-after surgeon in the territory. He created a steam tent over the bed, added medicinal herbs to the water, and prepared a tonic of willow bark and honey for when she could swallow. At midnight, when Emma's breathing eased and her fever began to break, Jackson sat back, exhaustion settling into his bones. He hadn't practiced medicine in 7 years, hadn't saved a life since the war. The sensation was alien and familiar all at once. Thornton hovered nearby, hope dawning on his haggard face. Is she going to make it? Jackson nodded, allowing himself the smallest measure of satisfaction. She'll need care for several days. I'll write down instructions. Thank you, Doc. I don't have much money, but I don't want your money. Jackson closed his medical bag with a decisive snap. Just keep her warm and follow my instructions. Outside, the storm had intensified. Fletcher helped Jackson into the sleigh, concern evident in his rheumy eyes. You did good in there, Mr. Ridge. Jackson said nothing, his gaze fixed on the swirling darkness ahead. But something had stirred within him, something he had buried alongside Elizabeth. The weight of his failure would always be there, but tonight, for the first time in 7 years, it was balanced by something else, the weight of a life saved. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall chimed midnight as Jackson stepped through his front door, snow melting from his coat onto the polished floorboards. Christmas had officially begun, though no decorations adorned the Ridge Ranch. Not since Elizabeth. He hung his coat and moved to his study, where embers still glowed in the hearth. On the mantel stood a daguerreotype in a silver frame. Elizabeth at 7, her smile captured forever, and Caroline beside her, beautiful and unaware of what lay ahead. Jackson poured a measure of whiskey into a crystal tumbler, but didn't drink it. He merely held it, watching firelight dance through the amber liquid. Will you be needing anything else, sir? Fletcher stood in the doorway, concern etched in the deep lines of his face. No, Fletcher. Get some rest. The old man hesitated. You did the right thing tonight. Perhaps it's time to... Good night, Fletcher. Left alone, Jackson placed the untouched whiskey on the desk and sank into his leather chair. The medical bag sat at his feet, a silent accusation and invitation. He had opened a door tonight that he had kept firmly shut for 7 years. What might follow him through it, he couldn't say. The wind rose outside, howling around the eaves of the house like a wounded animal. Jackson closed his eyes, listening to winter's fury and allowing just for a moment the memory of what it had been like to heal instead of harm. Then cutting through the storm's voice came another sound, faint, human, and desperate. A cry swiftly swallowed by the wind. Jackson sat forward, straining to hear. Had he imagined it? A trick of the storm, perhaps, or a memory of Elizabeth calling out in fever. There it came again, a voice raised in desperation or pain, coming from the direction of the main road. Fletcher appeared at the study door as if summoned. Did you hear that, Mr. Ridge? Sounds like someone out there. Jackson rose, crossing to the window. Through the frost-etched glass, he could see nothing but white fury. Could be someone lost in the storm, Fletcher suggested, or maybe just the wind playing tricks. Jackson stood motionless, paralyzed by indecision. Twice in one night, the past had come calling. First Thornton with his fever-stricken child, now this cry in the darkness. Was he meant to answer again? The cry came a third time, weaker now. Something shifted in Jackson's expression. He turned abruptly, retrieving his coat from the hook by the door. After a moment's hesitation, he grabbed the medical bag as well. Light the lanterns by the gate, he instructed Fletcher, and stoke the fire. If someone's out there, they'll need warming. The old caretaker nodded, relief evident in his weathered face. Yes, sir. The blast of cold nearly knocked Jackson back as he stepped onto the porch. Snow immediately blinded him, sticking to his eyelashes and beard. He raised a hand to shield his face, squinting into the maelstrom. The lantern's glow created a small sphere of visibility around him as he trudged toward the gates of the ranch. Each step required effort, his boots sinking deep into fresh powder. The cry had not come again, and doubt began to creep in. Perhaps it had been imagination after all, or some animal caught in the storm. Jackson paused at the gate, raising the lantern high. Nothing but swirling white met his eyes. He was about to turn back when a shape materialized from the blizzard, a darker shadow against the snow, huddled against his fence post. Moving closer, Jackson's breath caught. A young woman lay half buried in a drift, her dark hair crusted with ice. Her clothes, threadbare and unsuited to the weather, clung to her slender frame. Her face, partly visible beneath a snow-dusted shawl, showed a mixture of white and native features. She wasn't moving. Jackson knelt beside her, setting the lantern down. His fingers sought her wrist, feeling for a pulse. It was there, faint but present, a thread of life holding against the cold. "Can you hear me?" he asked, brushing snow from her face. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing dark eyes clouded with pain and fear. She tried to speak but could only manage a weak moan before her eyes rolled back. Jackson didn't hesitate. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and frozen cloth, and began the trudge back to the house. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and erratic. Fletcher was waiting at the door, eyes widening at the sight of the half-frozen young woman in Jackson's arms. "Clear the sofa by the fire," Jackson ordered, stepping inside. "And bring every blanket we have. Hot water, too, and the medicinal brandy." Fletcher hurried to obey as Jackson laid the young woman on the sofa. With clinical efficiency, he began to remove her wet outer garments. Her skin was alarmingly cold, lips tinged blue from hypothermia. As he worked to raise her body temperature, Jackson noticed a scar running along her left shoulder. A surgical scar, old but distinctive. Something about the pattern of sutures caught his attention. The incision had been closed with a particular technique, one he recognized because he had pioneered it himself during the war. Jackson paused, studying the scar more closely. The memory surfaced slowly: a field hospital near Shiloh, a Cherokee nurse with a severe shrapnel wound. Sarah Nighthawk. She had been pregnant, the wound dangerously close to threatening both her life and her unborn child's. He had developed the unconventional suturing technique specifically for her case, to minimize damage to underlying tissues. This girl would be the right age. And the scar. A small sound drew his attention back to the young woman's face. Her eyes had opened again, now alert with fear. She gasped and tried to push herself upright, panic giving her strength she shouldn't have had. "Easy," Jackson said, his voice dropping to the calm, authoritative tone he had used with wounded soldiers. "You're safe. I'm trying to help you." The girl stared at him, her expression feral with distrust. She glanced around wildly, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, then back to Jackson. Her body tensed like she might attempt to flee. "You were caught in the storm," Jackson continued evenly. "You're suffering from hypothermia. He hesitated, the words sticking in his throat. "A doctor. This is my home." Fletcher appeared with a stack of blankets in a steaming mug. "Here's the brandy with honey, Mr. Ridge." The girl's attention snapped to Fletcher, then back to Jackson. Some of the panic receded from her eyes, replaced by wariness and exhaustion. "What's your name?" Jackson asked. She remained silent, jaw clenched. "You don't have to tell me now, but I need you to drink this." He held out the mug. "It will help warm you from the inside." After a long moment of assessment, she reached for the mug with trembling hands. Jackson had to help her hold it as she sipped, grimacing at the strong taste but drinking obediently. "Good," he nodded. "Now lie back and rest. You're safe here." Her eyes stayed fixed on his face, searching for something. Truth or deception, he couldn't tell. Then, as the warmth of the brandy spread through her system, her eyelids grew heavy. She fought against sleep briefly before surrender claimed her, and she slipped back into unconsciousness. Jackson covered her with blankets, checking her pulse again. It was stronger now, her breathing more regular. She would survive the night. Fletcher lingered nearby, his expression troubled. "Who do you think she is?" "Looks to be part Indian." "Cherokee, if I had to guess," Jackson replied, still studying the surgical scar on her shoulder. "And yes, mixed blood." "You think she's a runaway, or maybe from the reservation?" Jackson shook his head. "Her clothes are worn but of good quality, not reservation issue." He gently replaced the blanket over her shoulder, concealing the scar. "We'll know more when she wakes." Fletcher frowned, glancing between the unconscious girl and Jackson. "Having her here, folks might talk, sir." "A young woman, alone with—" "She would have died in that storm, Fletcher." Jackson's tone brooked no argument. "What would you have had me do, leave her there?" "No, sir, of course not." The old man sighed. "I'll make up the guest room. She can move there when she's stable. After Fletcher departed, Jackson settled into the chair opposite the sofa, watching the steady rise and fall of the girl's chest. Each breath she took seemed like a small victory against the storm that still raged outside. The clock on the mantel ticked away the minutes of Christmas morning, marking time in a house that had been frozen in grief for 7 years. Jackson leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and whispered to the flames, "Maybe this time I don't fail." Morning brought pale sunlight filtering through frost-laced windows. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the world silent and pristine. Inside the guest bedroom of the Ridge Ranch, Abigail awoke disoriented, her body aching as if she'd been trampled by horses. She was in a clean bed she didn't recognize, beneath quilts that smelled of cedar and soap. Bandages wrapped her fingers where frostbite had threatened. Panic seized her as memory returned in fragments, running through the snow, the numbing cold, a stranger's arms carrying her. The door opened. A tall man entered carrying a breakfast tray, eggs, bacon, coffee. Gray threaded his dark hair at the temples, and lines of experience marked his face. His eyes, deep blue and guarded, assessed her with a clinical gaze. "You're awake," he observed, his voice deep and controlled. "That's good. How do you feel?" Abigail pressed herself against the headboard, pulling the quilt up like a shield. "My name is Jackson Ridge," the man continued, setting the tray on the bedside table. "You're at my ranch, about 15 miles north of Redemption. You're safe." The name Redemption sent a jolt of fear through her. She glanced toward the window, calculating. Jackson noticed. "The storm has passed, but there's 3 feet of fresh snow out there. You wouldn't get far." He stepped back toward the door, giving her space. "Eat first, then we can talk if you want. Or not, it's your choice." He left before she could respond, closing the door quietly behind him. Abigail stared at the food, her stomach cramping with hunger. After a moment's hesitation, she reached for the tray. The eggs were still warm, the bacon crisp. She ate ravenously, tears pricking her eyes at the simple luxury of hot food. When the plate was empty, she explored the room. It was plainly furnished, but comfortable. A walnut dresser, washstand with clean towels, a small writing desk beneath the window. Her clothes had been replaced with a flannel nightgown too large for her frame. Her own garments, clean and mended, lay folded on a chair. She dressed quickly, wincing as her thawing fingers protested. Through the window, she saw a well-kept ranch, a large barn, corral, bunkhouse, and outbuildings, all surrounded by pristine snowfields that stretched to distant mountains. A soft knock interrupted her assessment. Jackson Ridge stood at the threshold, waiting for permission to enter. "May I come in?" he asked formally. Abigail nodded, retreating to the far side of the room. "You look better," he observed. "Color's coming back to your face." She remained silent, watching him cautiously. "I need to check your hands and feet," he said. "Frostbite can cause damage even after warming." Abigail hesitated, then extended her bandaged hands. Jackson examined them professionally, his touch impersonal but gentle. "You were lucky," he said. "Another hour in that storm and you'd have lost fingers, maybe more." He stepped back. "What's your name?" She weighed her options, then finally spoke, her voice rough from disuse. "Abigail." "Just Abigail?" She nodded. "Where did you come from, Abigail?" The question hung in the air between them. Abigail studied the man's face, searching for signs of deception or threat. She found neither, only a careful neutrality that seemed practiced. "I worked for the Blackwood family in Redemption," she finally said, "as a housemaid." Jackson's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in his eyes at the name Blackwood. "And now you're running, Wito." Abigail looked away. "They accused me of stealing a silver candlestick." "Did you?" "No." Her answer came quick and firm, eyes flashing with indignation. "I never stole anything." Jackson considered this. "The Blackwoods are an influential family. Why would they accuse you falsely?" "Because they needed someone to blame, and I was convenient." Bitterness edged her voice. "Mr. Blackwood locked me in the cellar during their Christmas party. I broke the latch and ran." She met Jackson's gaze directly. "I thought I'd rather freeze than go back." Jackson nodded slowly, seeming to accept her account without judgment. "You mentioned working as a housemaid. Where's your family?" "Dead," Abigail's tone flattened. My mother died 5 years ago. I never knew my father. Your mother, was she Cherokee? Surprise registered on Abigail's face. Half. Her father was white. How did you know? Jackson hesitated as if considering how much to reveal. You have features that suggest mixed heritage. It was a guess. She sensed he wasn't being entirely truthful but let it pass. My mother was a nurse during the war. That's where she met my father, though she never told me his name. A pause, Vidon. After she died, I had nowhere to go. The Blackwoods took me in as a servant. Jackson absorbed this information, his expression unreadable. You can stay here through winter, he said finally. The passes will be snowed in for months anyway, and I could use help around the house. Abigail's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Why would you risk your reputation for me? You don't know me. Jackson turned to look out the window, his profile silhouetted against the bright snow. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, almost too quietly to hear, maybe I'm not the man I used to be. Without another word, he left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Abigail stood alone, uncertainty warring with cautious hope. She moved to the window again, looking out at the vast white landscape. The snow had covered everything, burying her tracks in any evidence of her desperate flight. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of safety. Not just survival, but a place where she might not need to be constantly afraid. The thought was almost more frightening than the danger she had fled. Fletcher found Jackson in his study later that morning, staring into the dead fireplace. The old caretaker placed a cup of coffee on the desk and cleared his throat. The girl's story, do you believe her? Jackson looked up. Does it matter? She was half dead in the snow. What would you have had me do? Fletcher sighed. You know that's not what I meant, sir. But taking in a runaway from the Blackwoods, that's asking for trouble. I'm not unfamiliar with trouble. Jackson took a sip of coffee. Besides, she'll be gone by spring. And if Blackwood comes looking before then? A hardness entered Jackson's eyes. Then I'll deal with Victor Blackwood. Fletcher studied his employer's face. There's something else. Something about the girl that bothers you. Jackson was silent for a long moment. She has a surgical scar on her shoulder. An unusual technique. And? I performed that surgery, Fletcher, during the war, on a Cherokee nurse named Sarah Nighthawk. He met the caretaker's gaze. She was pregnant at the time. Fletcher's eyes widened with understanding. You think? I don't know what I think, Jackson rose abruptly. But I do know that girl would have died without help, and I've let enough people die. He moved to the door. We need more firewood. I'll be in the barn. Fletcher watched him go, worry creasing his weathered face. He had served Jackson Ridge for over 15 years, had seen him rise as a celebrated surgeon, had witnessed his descent into grief and isolation after Elizabeth's death. Now, for the first time in 7 years, he saw something different in his employer's eyes, a dangerous spark of purpose. He sighed heavily. Winter had just begun, and already it promised to be unlike any they had weathered before. As days passed, Abigail's strength returned. She insisted on earning her keep, helping with household tasks despite Fletcher's initial protests. The elderly caretaker watched her with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant admiration as she took to the work with quiet efficiency. Jackson kept his distance, spending most days in the barn or riding fence lines, checking livestock against the bitter cold. But in the evenings, they would share meals in the dining room, an awkward trio bound by circumstance and winter's isolation. It was during one such dinner, a week after her arrival, that Abigail first noticed the locked door off the main hallway. She had assumed it was a storage room, but as she passed it carrying linens, she heard Jackson's voice from within, soft, almost tender, speaking to someone she couldn't see. Who stays in that room? She asked Fletcher later, as they washed dishes. The old man's hands stilled in the soapy water. No one. Not anymore. But I heard Mr. Ridge talking to someone. Fletcher's expression closed like a shutter. You misheard. That room belongs to the past, Miss Abigail. Best leave it there. His tone prevented further questions, but Abigail filed the mystery away, adding it to her growing list of oddities about Jackson Ridge and his isolated ranch. She had also begun to notice how Jackson watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, not with impropriety, but with a strange intensity, as if trying to confirm something. It made her uneasy, reminding her too much of how Victor Blackwood had watched her in those final weeks at his house. January was a week old when the first real test of their arrangement came. A ranch hand burst into the house just after sunrise, snow crusting his coat. "Mr. Ridge!" Stallion broke through the ice on the north pond. Jenkins pulled him out, but the horse's bad cut up and freezing. Jackson was already pulling on his coat. "Get blankets to the barn," he ordered Fletcher, then paused, glancing at Abigail. "Do you know anything about animals?" "Some," she replied cautiously. "My mother taught me about healing plants, and I helped with the Blackwoods horses." "Come then, we might need an extra pair of hands." The barn was organized chaos when they arrived. The black stallion lay on his side in a stall, shivering violently, a deep gash across his hindquarters. Two ranch hands worked to towel him dry, while a third struggled to keep him from thrashing. Jackson knelt beside the horse, examining the wound with practiced hands. "He's losing too much blood. The cut's deep, muscle damage." He looked up at the ranch hands. "Jenkins, get my medical bag from the house. Davis, I need hot water and clean cloths." The men hurried to obey, leaving Jackson, Fletcher, and Abigail with the injured animal. "Will you have to put him down?" Abigail asked quietly. Jackson shook his head. "Not if I can help it. He's my best stud, but the wound needs stitching, and he's too cold for the ether to work properly." Abigail hesitated, then spoke. "My mother knew a way to calm animals during treatment. A tea made from black cohosh root and valerian. It dulls pain without full unconsciousness." Jackson looked at her skeptically. "Cherokee medicine?" "Yes, but it works. I've seen it." A moment of consideration, then, "Fletcher, check the herb cabinet in my study. There should be dried herbs there." To Abigail's surprise, Fletcher nodded and hurried off. "You keep Cherokee medicines?" she asked. "I keep anything that works," Jackson replied simply, turning back to the horse. When the medical bag arrived, Jackson opened it with the same reverence Abigail had noticed the night he examined her hands. Inside were surgical instruments, neatly arranged and spotlessly clean, despite years of disuse. Abigail prepared the herbal tea according to her mother's teachings, while Jackson laid out suture materials. She couldn't help noticing how his hands moved with absolute precision, how his entire demeanor shifted into something more confident and focused. "You were more than just a doctor, weren't you?" she asked as they waited for the tea to steep. Jackson glanced up, surprised by the question. "I was a surgeon, army surgeon during the war, then private practice after." "Why did you stop?" His expression closed. "The tea ready?" Abigail nodded, letting the subject drop. Together, they administered the herbal preparation to the stallion. To Jackson's evident surprise, the animal calmed within minutes, his breathing steadying, though his eyes remained alert. "Remarkable," Jackson murmured. "Hold his head steady now." For the next hour, they worked in tandem, Jackson meticulously cleaning and suturing the wound, Abigail monitoring the horse's condition and passing instruments. She couldn't help admiring the surgeon's skill, the way he handled needle and thread with artist-like precision. When the last stitch was placed and the wound dressed, Jackson sat back on his heels, a sheen of sweat on his brow despite the barn's chill. "He should recover now," he said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Your herbal remedy was effective." Abigail felt a small glow of pride at the grudging compliment. "My mother would say we healed him together. Your skill and her knowledge." Something shifted in Jackson's expression, a flicker of recognition or memory. "Your mother? The nurse? What was her name?" The question seemed casual, but Abigail sensed its importance. "Sarah," she replied. "Sarah Nighthawk." Jackson nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. "She taught you well." As they walked back to the house, Abigail felt Jackson's gaze on her again, that same searching look. But now, instead of unease, she felt curiosity stirring. There was a connection here she couldn't yet see between her mother, this former surgeon, and the mysterious locked room that belonged to the past. Winter had just begun, and already Abigail sensed that Jackson Ridge's offer of shelter might lead to revelations she hadn't anticipated when she fled into the Christmas Eve blizzard. 2 weeks after the incident with the stallion, Jackson announced they would be making a trip into Redemption for supplies. "Is that wise?" Fletcher asked, glancing meaningfully at Abigail. "The Blackwoods? We need provisions," Jackson cut him off. and the roads are finally passable. Abigail has been here over 3 weeks with no sign of pursuit. Perhaps they've forgotten about their accusations. Abigail doubted this. Victor Blackwood was not a man who forgot, especially when his pride was involved. But she also knew that eventually she would have to face the town again. Better with Jackson Ridge at her side than alone. The journey into redemption took most of the morning, the sleigh moving slowly through the deep snow. As they approached the town, Abigail felt anxiety knotting her stomach. She pulled her scarf higher, partially obscuring her face. Redemption had begun as a mining settlement 30 years earlier when silver was discovered in the nearby mountains. Now it was a proper town with a main street lined with false-fronted businesses, a general store, saloon, bank, assayer's office, and a few other establishments catering to the needs of miners in the scattered ranches in the valley. Jackson guided the sleigh down the main street, past the grand church whose spire gave the town its optimistic name. People stopped to stare, not only because Jackson Ridge rarely came to town, but because of the young woman beside him whose mixed heritage was evident despite her attempts to conceal her face. "Keep your head high," Jackson murmured as they pulled up before the general store. "You've done nothing wrong." Abigail tried to take comfort in his words, but she could already feel the weight of judgment pressing down. Whispers followed them as they entered the store, speculation about who she was and what she was doing with the reclusive Dr. Ridge. Mrs. Hollis, the storekeeper's wife, gave them a pinched smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Dr. Ridge, a surprise to see you in town." Jackson nodded curtly. "We need supplies. Sugar, coffee, flour, and some fabric for Miss Abigail." Mrs. Hollis's gaze raked over Abigail, recognition dawning. "Aren't you the Blackwood girl? The one who—" "She works for me now," Jackson interrupted. "The fabric, please." They were selecting yard goods when the store's bell jangled. Victor Blackwood himself entered, removing gloves from his long-fingered hands. At 60, he remained an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, though his face had grown gaunt in recent months, his skin carrying an unhealthy yellow tint. The store fell silent. Blackwood's gaze swept the room, settling on Abigail with cold recognition. "Well," he said, voice carrying in the hushed space, "if it isn't the thief herself. And Dr. Ridge, I heard rumors, but I scarcely believed them." His mouth curved in a humorless smile. "Harboring criminals now, Ridge? What would your dear departed daughter think?" Abigail felt Jackson tense beside her. His voice, when he replied, was controlled but edged with ice. "My business is my own, Blackwood, as is who I choose to employ." "Is it employment or charity?" Blackwood's eyes never left Abigail. "Or perhaps something else. She is a pretty little half-breed, despite her dishonest tendencies." Jackson stepped forward, positioning himself between Abigail and Blackwood. "We've made our purchases, Mrs. Hollis. Please have them delivered to my sleigh." He placed a protective hand on Abigail's back, guiding her toward the door. Blackwood didn't move from their path, forcing them to edge around him. As Abigail passed, Blackwood leaned in slightly. "This isn't over, girl," he murmured, too low for others to hear. "A Blackwood always collects his debts." Outside, the winter air felt cleansing after the store's stifling atmosphere. Jackson helped Abigail into the sleigh, his movements precise but tension evident in the set of his shoulders. "I'm sorry," Abigail said once they were moving. "I've brought trouble to your door." Jackson kept his eyes on the road. "Trouble and I are old acquaintances." After a pause, he added, "Blackwood and I have history that predates you." "What kind of history?" The reins tightened in Jackson's grip. "The kind that's best left buried." He glanced at her. "But I should know what I'm defending. Tell me the real reason you ran from the Blackwood house." Abigail hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "Mr. Blackwood took a special interest in me when I first came to work for them. Nothing inappropriate," she added quickly, seeing Jackson's expression darken. "But he watched me, asked questions about my mother, kept me close. And then accused you of theft." "Yes, but only after—" She took a deep breath. "Only after I found something while cleaning his office. Papers about the mine. Records that didn't match the official ones. I think he was hiding profits. Maybe from his investors or the government." Jackson processed this. "You think he accused you to discredit you, in case you spoke about what you'd seen?" Abigail nodded. "He didn't know I could read. Half-breeds aren't supposed to be educated, but my mother taught me. A hint of approval crossed Jackson's face. Sarah Nighthawk sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. Abigail studied his profile. You speak as if you knew her. Jackson's gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, his expression giving nothing away. I knew many nurses during the war. Perhaps our paths crossed. The rest of the journey passed in silence, but Abigail sensed a shift in their relationship. Jackson Ridge was a man of secrets. That much had been clear from the start. But now she began to suspect that some of those secrets might be connected to her own past. As they approached the ranch, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. Fletcher met them at the door, relief evident on his weathered face. Any trouble in town? He asked, helping unload the supplies. Nothing unexpected, Jackson replied. Then almost to himself, the game has begun. That's all. Fletcher's worried gaze met Abigail's over Jackson's shoulder. Whatever game had started, they both sensed that the stakes might be higher than any of them yet realized. January deepened, locking the Montana Valley in ice. Days shortened to brief windows of pale sunlight between long stretches of star-filled darkness. At the Ridge Ranch, routine settled over the unlikely household. Jackson attending to ranch business, Fletcher maintaining the house, and Abigail finding her place between them. The encounter with Blackwood had changed something. Jackson spent more evenings in his study, door closed, lamplight burning late into the night. Fletcher grew watchful, checking locks and scanning the horizon for approaching riders. And Abigail found herself caught in currents she couldn't fully understand, sensing that her presence had awakened dormant tensions. She began to notice small things. How Fletcher sometimes slipped and called her Miss Sarah before correcting himself. How Jackson's gaze lingered on her hands when she worked with herbs, as if seeing another's movements superimposed over hers. Most of all, she noticed the weight of unspoken histories pressing down on the ranch house, as tangible as the snow blanketing its roof. One morning, 3 weeks after the redemption visit, Abigail was chopping vegetables for stew when shouting erupted from the yard. She moved to the window to see a cluster of men on horseback at the gate, ranch hands surrounding a stranger whose horse had collapsed beneath him. Jackson emerged from the barn, striding toward the commotion. Even from a distance, his bearing had changed, shoulders squared, movements precise, the hesitation that usually marked his demeanor gone. Fletcher appeared at Abigail's shoulder. Trouble, he muttered. Better put water to boil. Lots of it. What's happening? Mining accident by the looks of it. That's Pete Hollow from the Blackwood mine. Horse ran itself to death getting here. Within minutes, the injured man was carried into the house and laid on the dining table. Blood soaked through his rough clothes, and his breathing came in pained gasps. 2 more miners supported him, their faces grim beneath coal dust and sweat. Cave-in, one explained as Jackson examined the injured man. Support beam snapped, crushed his leg and side. Doc Peterson's gone to Helena for supplies. Someone remembered you were a surgeon once. Jackson's face was unreadable as he cut away the miner's clothing to reveal a mangled leg and a torso mottled with bruising. Fletcher, my medical bag. Abigail, I need hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey, both for him and the instruments. The kitchen transformed into a surgical theater. Jackson worked with mechanical precision, cleaning the wounds, assessing damage. Abigail assisted without being asked, handing him supplies before he could request them, as if they had performed this dance countless times. The leg's too damaged, Jackson said, after a thorough examination. I'll have to take it below the knee. The miner's companions blanched. You sure, Doc? Pete's got 3 kids. Can't work the mine with 1 leg. He can't work dead either, Jackson replied flatly. This or nothing. The amputation was brutal and efficient. Jackson moved with the confidence of a man who had performed such procedures 100 times before, which Abigail realized he likely had. The war had produced thousands of such operations. What surprised her was her own steadiness. She had never witnessed surgery, yet found herself anticipating each step, supporting Jackson's work as if guided by some deeper knowledge. Even Fletcher seemed taken aback by her composure. When it was over, the miner stabilized but unconscious. Jackson stepped outside. Abigail found him on the porch, staring at his bloodied hands, his breath clouding in the frigid air. You saved his life, she said quietly. Jackson didn't look up. Perhaps, or perhaps I've condemned him to a half-life of charity and pity. Life is life. My mother used to say a man with one leg still has two hands and a heart. A ghost of a smile touched Jackson's lips. Sarah would say that. He finally looked at Abigail, his expression unguarded for the first time since she'd met him. You're very like her. Before Abigail could respond, one of the miners joined them. Doc, we can't thank you enough. The company will pay. I don't want Blackwood's money, Jackson interrupted, his momentary openness vanishing. But I do want information. What caused the cave-in? The miner hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if Blackwood might materialize in the yard. Officially, loose rock, bad luck. And unofficially, they've been pushing deeper into the mountain, following a new silver vein. Some of the men reported water seepage last week, underground spring or something. Support beams started rotting. Foreman said to shore them up with whatever was at hand and keep digging. He lowered his voice. There's been talk that the vein is running out. Blackwood's getting desperate to find more ore. Jackson absorbed this information, something calculating in his gaze. And the water in the mine, what's it like? The miner looked puzzled by the question. Strange, actually. Smells funny. Some of the men been getting sick after working the lower levels. Fevers, mostly. A muscle tightened in Jackson's jaw. I see. After the miners departed, taking their unconscious friend on a makeshift stretcher, an unnatural quiet fell over the house. Fletcher and Abigail cleaned the dining room in silence, removing all evidence of the impromptu surgery. Jackson disappeared into his study, the sound of a cabinet unlocking the only indication of his presence. That evening, as Abigail carried linens down the hall, she again passed the mysterious locked room. This time, the door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of lamplight spilling onto the floorboards. She hesitated, knowing she should continue on, respect the boundary that had been clearly established. But curiosity, the same that had led her to examine Blackwood's private papers, pulled her forward. She paused before the door, listening. No sound came from within. Carefully, she pushed it open wider. The room beyond was not what she had expected. Instead of a bedroom, it was a study or laboratory of sorts. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with medical text. A large desk occupied the center, covered with papers, specimen jars, and what appeared to be water samples labeled with dates and locations. A map of the Redemption Valley hung on one wall, marked with red pins clustering around the Blackwood mine and a nearby stream. Most surprising were the photographs. A young girl with dark curls and bright eyes, captured at various ages. In one larger portrait, she sat beside a beautiful woman, both smiling, their resemblance unmistakable. Mother and daughter, Abigail guessed. The same pair from the photograph in Jackson's study. That's Elizabeth. Abigail startled at Jackson's voice behind her. She turned, apology ready on her lips, but his expression wasn't angry, just weary, resigned, as if he had expected this moment. I'm sorry, she said quickly. The door was open. I didn't mean to pry. Yes, you did. It wasn't an accusation, merely a statement of fact. Curiosity is in your nature. It was in your mother's, too. Abigail's breath caught. You did know her? Jackson nodded slowly, then gestured for her to enter the room fully. Come in. Perhaps it's time you understood what you've walked into. Abigail stepped inside, taking in more details. Medical instruments, journals filled with handwritten notes, bottles of chemicals. This was her room? Elizabeth's? Yes, she was 8 when she died. Scarlet fever, we thought at first. Jackson moved to the desk, touching the papers with reverent familiarity. But I've spent 7 years studying what really happened. I don't understand. Jackson turned to face her, his expression grave. Elizabeth didn't die from ordinary scarlet fever. She died from poisoning. Heavy metal contamination in the water. The fever was a symptom, not the cause. Poisoning? From where? The Blackwood mine. Jackson gestured to the map. 7 years ago, they opened a new shaft that cut through an underground aquifer. The excavation released minerals into the groundwater. Arsenic, lead, mercury. Elizabeth drank from our well, which draws from the same water table. His voice tightened. I was so certain it was just a fever that I delayed seeking help. By the time I realized how serious it was, a blizzard had blocked the roads. Abigail felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. And Blackwood knew? I believe so. His own testing would have shown contamination, but acknowledging it would have meant closing the mine, or at least that section of it. Jackson's eyes hardened. The night Elizabeth took a turn for the worse, I went to town for medicine. Blackwood detained me at the bank, insisting I sign paperwork for a loan payment. It cost me hours, critical hours. He let your daughter die for profit, Abigail whispered, horror dawning. Not just Elizabeth. There have been other children, other illnesses in families who draw water from that aquifer. Fevers that come and go, strange rashes, weakness. Jackson gestured to his research. I've been documenting it all, building a case. Why not take it to the authorities? Blackwood is the authorities in redemption. He owns the sheriff, the mayor, most of the businesses. And I had no proof, only suspicions. A bitter smile touched his lips. Until now. The mine accident today, Abigail realized. The water seepage. Yes, it confirms what I've suspected. They've reopened the shaft that caused the initial contamination, probably hoping to find more silver. Jackson studied her face. And then you arrived, with knowledge of Blackwood's falsified records. Another piece of the puzzle. Abigail processed this revelation, connecting it to her own experiences at the Blackwood house. That's why he watched me so closely. He must have suspected I was looking at his papers. Perhaps. Jackson hesitated, then asked, what exactly did you see in those records? Discrepancies between reported ore quantities and actual extraction. 2 sets of books, one for investors and government inspectors, one for himself. Abigail paused. And there were medical reports, workers falling ill, compensation paid to families. All very secret. Jackson nodded, unsurprised. More evidence of the contamination. He's been covering it up for years. They fell silent, the weight of these revelations settling between them. Finally, Abigail asked the question that had been building since she first saw the surgical scar on her shoulder. What does my mother have to do with this? You recognized my scar the first night, didn't you? Something shifted in Jackson's expression. A decision being made. I performed that surgery during the war. Your mother had been wounded by shrapnel, the injury dangerously close to her womb. She was 5 months pregnant with you at the time. Abigail felt the world tilt slightly. You saved both of us. I used an experimental technique to minimize damage to the underlying tissues. The scar pattern is unique, my signature, in a way. He met her gaze directly. When I saw it on you, I knew immediately who you were. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have trusted me? A stranger claiming a connection to your past? Jackson shook his head. I needed to be certain first, and I needed to understand why, of all places, you had ended up at the Blackwood house. A new thought struck Abigail. Did Blackwood know about you saving my mother? I don't know, but I suspect he knew who your mother was. Jackson hesitated. Sarah Nighthawk was more than just a nurse during the war. She was also gathering intelligence for the Union, documenting supply movements, prisoner conditions. She was remarkably observant, and people often spoke freely around her, assuming her heritage made her simple or unintelligent. Pride swelled in Abigail's chest. She never told me that part. She wouldn't have. It was dangerous knowledge. Jackson's expression softened. She was extraordinary, your mother. Brave, intelligent, stubborn. You remind me of her in many ways. Before Abigail could respond, heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway. Fletcher appeared at the door, his expression grim. Mr. Ridge, there's something you need to see. They followed Fletcher to the front porch. In the distance, a line of torches moved through the darkness, approaching the ranch along the snow-packed road. Riders from town, Fletcher said, at least 6 of them. And that's the sheriff at the front. Jackson's face hardened. So Blackwood makes his move. He turned to Abigail. Stay inside. If things go badly, Fletcher will help you leave through the back. There are supplies in the storage cellar. I won't run, Abigail protested. Not again. This isn't your fight. You just spent an hour explaining exactly why it is my fight. Her chin lifted in defiance. I'm staying. Before Jackson could argue further, the riders reached the front gate. Sheriff Davies dismounted, followed by his deputy and 4 other men, including Victor Blackwood himself, wrapped in a heavy fur coat against the bitter cold. Jackson stepped off the porch into the yard, positioning himself between the approaching men and the house. "Sheriff Davies, a late hour for a social call." Davies looked uncomfortable, avoiding direct eye contact. "This isn't social, Ridge. I have a warrant for the girl." He extracted a folded paper from his coat. "New evidence has come to light. Mrs. Blackwood's pearl brooch was found among her belongings. A family heirloom, very valuable." "Convenient timing," Jackson observed coldly. "The same day I treat one of Blackwood's miners for injuries sustained in an unsafe mine shaft." Blackwood stepped forward, the torchlight accentuating the unhealthy yellow tint of his skin. "The timing is irrelevant, Doctor. The law is the law." A smile spread across his gaunt face, never reaching his eyes. "Unless, of course, you'd like to discuss those overdue taxes on your land. I hold the note from the bank, after all." The threat hung in the frozen air between them. Abigail, who had moved to stand beside Jackson despite his instructions, felt anger rise within her. Always the same pattern, Blackwood using money and influence to crush opposition. "I'll go," she said suddenly. "Abigail, no," Jackson began. "I won't let you lose your home because of me." She turned to face the sheriff. "I'll come peacefully, but I want a fair trial. Public, with witnesses." Sheriff Davies shifted uncomfortably. "Of course, that's your right." Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "Don't be hasty, Sheriff. The girl is clearly a flight risk. She's run once already." "I'll give you 48 hours, Davies said to Jackson, ignoring Blackwood. "Bring her into town yourself, proper-like. After that, I come back with a posse." "And the town meeting is in 3 days, Blackwood added, "where we'll vote on seizing your property for unpaid debts, unless you cooperate, of course." He turned his horse, the movement triggering a fit of coughing that he struggled to control. When he recovered, he fixed Jackson with a malevolent stare. 3 days, Ridge. Choose wisely." The riders departed, torches receding into the darkness like malevolent spirits. Jackson, Abigail, and Fletcher remained in the yard, cold seeping through their clothes. "He's desperate," Fletcher observed. "Never seen him push so hard." "He's dying," Jackson replied flatly. "The same contamination that killed Elizabeth and sickened others is now poisoning him. Poetic justice, if it weren't for the collateral damage." Abigail hugged herself against the cold. "What do we do now?" Jackson's gaze remained fixed on the distant torches, calculation in his eyes. "Now we use the 48 hours to build our case. Fletcher, send word to Marshal Collins in Helena. He owes me from Shiloh." Fletcher nodded and moved toward the barn to prepare a rider. "And me?" Abigail asked. Jackson turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "You said you knew where Blackwood kept his real records. Could you draw a map of his office? Show exactly where they're hidden?" A slow smile spread across Abigail's face. "I can do better than that. I can tell you when he'll be away from the house, which floorboard creaks, and which maid can be bribed to look the other way." For the first time since she'd met him, Jackson Ridge smiled fully. A transformation that stripped away years of grief and revealed the man he must have been before tragedy hardened him. "Sarah's daughter indeed," he said softly. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Abigail was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when a knock sounded at the back door. Fletcher answered it, hand resting on the pistol at his hip. An elderly Native American man stood on the threshold, wrapped in furs and leathers despite the bitter cold. Deep lines etched his copper face, and his long white hair was braided with intricate care. "Two wolves," Fletcher said, recognition and surprise in his voice. "What brings you down from the mountains?" The old man's dark eyes moved past Fletcher to settle on Abigail. "I heard Sarah Nighthawk's daughter had returned." His English was accented but clear. "I came to see with my own eyes." Fletcher hesitated, then stepped aside to let the man enter. "Mr. Ridge is out checking cattle. He'll be back soon." Two Wolves nodded but seemed unconcerned with Jackson's whereabouts. His attention remained fixed on Abigail, studying her with an intensity that might have been uncomfortable if not for the kindness in his gaze. "You have her eyes," he said finally, "the same way of seeing beyond surfaces." "You knew my mother?" Abigail asked, setting down the bowl she'd been stirring. "She was my sister's child, half-blood, like you, with a foot in two worlds." He moved closer, his movements deliberate and dignified despite his age. When she died, I lost track of you. Then word came that Victor Blackwood had taken in a mixed-blood girl. I suspected, but could not be certain. How did you know I was here? A hint of amusement touched the old man's weathered face. The land speaks, the wind carries stories, and sometimes I pay the boy who delivers mail and redemption to tell me of strange happenings. Fletcher snorted softly. Practical magic. Two Wolves ignored the comment. I bring you something that belonged to your mother. From within his fur coat, he produced a small leather pouch, worn with age. She left it with me for safekeeping, saying one day it might be needed. Abigail accepted the pouch with trembling hands. Inside was a folded piece of paper, brittle with age, and a silver medallion on a leather cord. The medallion bore unusual markings, half military insignia, half Cherokee symbols. A token of two worlds, Two Wolves explained, given to her by your father. Abigail's heart quickened. You knew my father? I knew of him. The old man's expression grew guarded. The paper is more important. Read it when you are alone. The back door opened and Jackson entered, stamping snow from his boots. He froze at the sight of Two Wolves, surprise and wariness crossing his face. Medicine Chief, he said after a moment. It's been many years. Two Wolves inclined his head slightly. Doctor, you have aged. As have we all. Jackson glanced at Abigail, noting the pouch in her hands. I see you've made introductions. He knew my mother, Abigail explained. He's brought me something of hers. Jackson nodded, a complex emotion flickering across his features. Fletcher, perhaps some coffee for our guest before he returns to the mountains? The two men retreated to Jackson's study, leaving Abigail to examine her mother's legacy in privacy. She carefully unfolded the brittle paper, revealing a letter written in a flowing, educated hand. My dearest Abigail, if you are reading this, I am gone, and Two Wolves has found you. There is much I could not tell you in life about your father, for your safety and his reputation. But you deserve truth. Your father was not a soldier, as I sometimes implied, but a man of standing in the white world. We loved truly, if briefly. When he learned I carried his child, he offered money but not his name. I refused both. You were born of love, not shame, and I would not have you raised with either his guilty charity or his absence. Yet there is more you should know. In my work during the war, I discovered your father's involvement in dealings that were not honorable. Weapons sold to both sides, medicine diverted for profit. I gathered evidence, but never used it, for your sake. That evidence remains hidden where we last lived together, beneath the third floorboard from the east wall in the cabin's main room. If danger ever finds you because of your heritage or your connection to him, use it to protect yourself. Your father's name is Victor Blackwood. With eternal love, your mother, Sarah Nighthawk. Abigail read the letter 3 times, each reading sending a fresh wave of shock through her system. Victor Blackwood, the man who had taken her in as a servant, watched her with that strange intensity, then accused her of theft, was her father. The revelation clicked other pieces into place. Why he had hired her despite her mixed blood when others wouldn't. Why he had kept her close. Why her escape had triggered such a disproportionate response. She was still absorbing this revelation when Jackson and Two Wolves returned from the study. One look at her face told them she had read the letter. You knew, she said to Two Wolves, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. The old man nodded solemnly. It was not my truth to tell until you had your mother's words. And you? She turned to Jackson. Did you suspect? Jackson hesitated. I knew Sarah had been involved with someone of influence during the war. There were rumors, but she never named him to me. Two Wolves watched their exchange with ancient eyes that seemed to see more than was visible. The circle completes itself. Daughter, father, healer, all connected by old wounds and older secrets. Blackwood doesn't know that I know, Abigail said slowly, thinking aloud. That gives us an advantage. Perhaps, Two Wolves agreed, but a wounded bear is most dangerous when cornered. Blackwood's sickness grows. The poison he released into the earth returns to him. He turned to Jackson. You have seen the signs. Jackson nodded. Jaundice, weight loss, neurological symptoms, advanced heavy metal poisoning most likely. He hasn't much time. Then he has nothing to lose, Abigail realized. He'll do whatever it takes to protect his legacy and fortune. Which makes our next steps critical. Jackson's expression was grim but determined. Abigail, are you certain you want to continue with this? Now that you know? Abigail looked down at her mother's letter, then at the medallion that symbolized her dual heritage. When she raised her head, her decision was written in the set of her jaw and the fire in her eyes. More certain than ever. He rejected my mother. He used me as a servant in his house without acknowledging me, and he poisoned countless people, including your daughter, for profit. Her voice hardened. He may be my father by blood, but he's earned no right to my loyalty. Two Wolves nodded approvingly. Sarah's spirit burns in you. He rose to leave. I must return to the mountains before the next snow. But remember, you carry two bloodlines, two strengths. In the days ahead, you will need both. After the old man's departure, Jackson, Fletcher, and Abigail gathered in the study to formulate their plan. The revelation about Blackwood being Abigail's father had added a new dimension to their strategy. We need three things, Jackson said, pacing before the fireplace. First, proof of the water contamination from the mine. I have most of that from my research, but we need current samples from the new shaft. Fletcher nodded. Pete Hollow's friends might help with that. They owe you for saving his life. Second, we need Blackwood's falsified records to prove he knew about the contamination and concealed it. Jackson turned to Abigail. That's where your knowledge of his house becomes crucial. And third, she asked, we need witnesses, people who've been affected by the contaminated water, families who've lost children or become ill. Jackson's expression darkened. I've been documenting cases for years, but many are afraid to speak against Blackwood. My mother's evidence might help, Abigail suggested. Two Wolves said it was hidden in our old cabin. Jackson considered this. Where was this cabin? East of Redemption, near the creek. We lived there until I was 12 when she died. Abigail frowned. But that was 5 years ago. It might not even be standing anymore. It's worth investigating. Fletcher, tomorrow you'll ride out there with Jenkins. Jackson's expression was grim but determined. Tonight we prepare for all possibilities, including failure. As darkness fell, snow began to accumulate again, a fresh layer covering the day's activities. Abigail stood at the window of her room, watching crystalline flakes swirl in the lamplight. The world had shifted beneath her feet today, revealing her true parentage and connecting her fate to Jackson's in ways she couldn't have imagined when she collapsed at his gate on Christmas Eve. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Jackson stood at her door, holding something wrapped in cloth. May I come in? Abigail nodded, curious. Jackson unwrapped the bundle, revealing a pistol, small but well-crafted. It was my wife Caroline's, for protection at the ranch when I was away. He held it out to her. I want you to have it, just in case. You think we'll fail? I think preparation honors the risk. His blue eyes held hers steadily. Blackwood is dying and desperate. That makes him unpredictable. Abigail accepted the weapon, its weight unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Thank you. Jackson turned to leave but paused at the threshold. Abigail, regardless of what happens with Blackwood, you have a place here, if you want it. The offer hung in the air between them. Not charity, not employment, but something more profound. A home. Family, perhaps, of a sort neither had expected to find. Thank you, she said again, the words inadequate for the emotion behind them. After Jackson left, Abigail returned to the window, the pistol still in her hand. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing boundaries and covering the scars of the land. Tomorrow they would act against Blackwood, entering a battle whose outcome was far from certain. But tonight, in this moment of quiet, she allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Dawn broke clear and cold, the temperature well below zero. Fletcher departed early with Jenkins to search for Sarah Nighthawk's cabin and the evidence it might contain. Jackson and Abigail spent the morning reviewing their strategy, timing each element with military precision. The town meeting is tomorrow evening, Jackson reminded her. Marshal Collins may not arrive in time. We need to be prepared to present our case without federal backing. Abigail nodded, studying the map of Redemption with its marked water sources and affected households. If Blackwood follows his usual schedule, he'll be at the bank all morning. That gives me time to search his office. It's too dangerous for you to go alone. It has to be me. I know the house, the staff, the routine. Abigail met his concerned gaze. Besides, who would suspect a thief of returning to the scene of her crime? Jackson didn't like it, but he recognized the logic. At the first sign of trouble, you get out. Promise me. I promise. They were interrupted by the arrival of a rider, Sam Thornton, his face grim beneath his frost-covered hat. "Doc Ridge," he called as Jackson met him in the yard. "Thought you should know. There's talk in town. Blackwood's gathered a group of men offering good money to join a posse. Says he's tired of waiting for the sheriff to act." Jackson's expression hardened. "How many men?" "Dozen or so, mostly drifters and miners who owe him. They're planning to ride out here tonight." Thornton's voice lowered. "Some are saying they don't much care if the girl survives the arrest." "Thank you for the warning, Sam." After Thornton departed, Jackson returned to find Abigail already preparing for departure, her mother's medallion around her neck and Caroline's pistol hidden in her coat. "You heard?" "Enough," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "This changes nothing. If anything, it means we need to act faster." Jackson wanted to argue, to protect her from the danger ahead, but the determination in her stance reminded him too much of Sarah Nighthawk to think he could dissuade her. "Very well," he conceded, "but we'll adapt the plan. Instead of returning here, we'll meet at the church in Redemption at sundown. The minister, Reverend Howard, was a friend to your mother. He'll offer sanctuary if needed." Abigail nodded, securing her hat. "One way or another, this ends today." As they prepared the sleigh, Fletcher and Jenkins returned, their expressions revealing success before they spoke. "We found it," Fletcher announced, "abandoned but still standing, and this was beneath the floorboard, just as the letter said." He produced a small metal box, its lid sealed with wax bearing a Cherokee symbol. Inside lay a leather-bound journal and several folded documents with military letterheads. Abigail quickly scanned the contents, her eyes widening. "These are shipping manifests and contracts," she said, "all signed by Victor Blackwood, showing diversions of medical supplies meant for field hospitals." She turned a page. "And here, payments from Confederate buyers for those same supplies." Jackson examined the documents, profiteering from both sides during the war. "That's treason." "And this," Abigail continued, lifting a faded daguerreotype from the bottom of the box. It showed a younger Victor Blackwood standing beside Sarah Nighthawk, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. Proof of their connection. "This changes our approach," Jackson decided. "We won't just expose the mine contamination. We'll use this to force Blackwood to acknowledge you publicly. The threat of revealing his treasonous past should be leverage enough." Within the hour, they were on the road to redemption, the fate of 3 intersecting lives balanced on the evidence they carried and the justice they sought. The weather held clear but bitterly cold, the sun offering light without warmth. As they approached town, Jackson turned to Abigail. "Whatever happens today, remember this. You are your mother's daughter first and foremost. Blackwood's blood may run in your veins, but it's Sarah's spirit that defines you." Abigail touched the medallion at her throat. "And you, Dr. Ridge? Who am I to you?" Jackson's eyes softened, revealing the man beneath the armor of grief he'd worn for 7 years. A second chance, perhaps, for both of us. They parted at the edge of town, Jackson to meet with Sheriff Davies and present their evidence of contamination, Abigail to infiltrate the Blackwood mansion and retrieve the falsified mining records. As they separated, neither knew that Fletcher had ridden ahead with a message that would irrevocably alter the course of their carefully laid plans. For Victor Blackwood, despite his declining health, had one final move to make in this deadly game, one that would force a reckoning none of them had anticipated. Redemption lay quiet under the winter sun, its streets hardened to ice, smoke rising from chimneys and vertical columns that dissolved against the crystalline blue sky. To casual observers, the town appeared peaceful, a frontier settlement enduring another Montana winter with stoic resignation. Beneath this tranquil surface, however, currents of tension swirled. In the saloon, men with hard eyes and cash-filled pockets waited for orders. At the sheriff's office, Davies stared at his reflection in a small mirror, questioning the face that looked back at him. And at the grand house on the hill, Victor Blackwood stood at his study window, watching the town below like a chess player contemplating his endgame. Abigail approached the Blackwood mansion from the rear, using the servant's path. She had exchanged her borrowed clothes from the Ridge Ranch for her old servant's dress, kept in her bundle when she fled. The familiar fabric felt like a costume now, a remnant of a life that belonged to someone else. The back door opened to the kitchen, where Mrs. Hanson, the cook, was preparing lunch. The older woman gasped when she saw Abigail, nearly dropping the pot she held. "Lord above, girl! What are you doing back here? Mr. Blackwood will have you arrested on sight." "I forgot something important," Abigail replied, forcing a nervous smile. "Something that proves I didn't steal anything." "Is he home?" Mrs. Hanson glanced toward the front of the house. "He's in his study, but he has a visitor, that Fletcher fellow from the Ridge Ranch." She lowered her voice. "Been strange doings all morning. Men coming and going, Mr. Blackwood coughing blood into his handkerchief when he thinks no one's looking." Abigail concealed her surprise at the mention of Fletcher. What was he doing here? The plan had been for him to wait at the church with the evidence from her mother's cabin. "I'll be quick," she promised. "Just need to check my old room, then I'll be gone." Mrs. Hanson hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful. He's not himself lately. Rage one minute, odd sentimentality the next. Yesterday he spent an hour staring at an old photograph, then threw an inkwell at the wall." Abigail slipped from the kitchen into the back staircase, her heart pounding. She knew exactly which photograph had triggered Blackwood's outburst, the one of him and her mother, the twin of which now resided in the metal box from the cabin. The servants' quarters were deserted at this hour, everyone occupied with their midday duties. Abigail moved silently down the corridor to her former room, a spare closet barely large enough for a narrow bed and a small trunk. The space felt smaller than she remembered, the ceiling lower, the walls more confining. She knelt beside the loose floorboard where she had hidden her meager treasures, her mother's hairbrush, a small book of Cherokee stories, and a smooth riverstone two wolves had given her for protection. All were undisturbed. Blackwood's men had been looking for stolen silver, not worthless mementos. Retrieving her belongings, Abigail steeled herself for the more dangerous part of her mission. Blackwood's study was on the first floor, at the front of the house. She would need to descend the main staircase, cross the foyer, and somehow access the office without being seen. And she would need to do it while Blackwood was meeting with Fletcher, a complication she hadn't anticipated. Moving to the servants' landing, she peered down at the entrance hall. Voices drifted from the partially open study door. Blackwood's cultured tones interspersed with Fletcher's rougher cadence. She couldn't make out the words, but the exchange seemed heated. Taking a deep breath, Abigail descended the stairs, careful to avoid the third step that always creaked. At the bottom, she pressed herself against the wall, listening. The conversation in the study had dropped to murmurs. Then came the sound of a glass being set down hard on wood. "Enough!" Blackwood's voice rose suddenly. "I won't be threatened in my own home. Tell Ridge he'll get nothing from me." Abigail froze. Whatever Fletcher had come to discuss, it clearly wasn't proceeding as planned. "It's not a threat, Mr. Blackwood." Fletcher's voice remained steady. "It's an opportunity to do right by your daughter before the end." A heavy silence followed this statement. Abigail held her breath, her own existence suddenly the center of a confrontation she hadn't expected. "Get out." Blackwood's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Before I have you thrown out." "Think on it, sir. That's all the doctor asks." Footsteps approached the study door. Abigail pressed herself into an alcove beneath the stairs as Fletcher emerged, his weathered face grim. He paused in the foyer, as if sensing her presence, but didn't turn in her direction. After a moment, he departed through the front door, shoulders set in resignation. Abigail waited, counting heartbeats. From within the study came the sound of glass shattering, Blackwood's temper finding release. Then heavy coughing, followed by silence. It was now or never. Moving silently across the foyer, she approached the study door. Through the narrow opening, she could see Blackwood seated at his desk, back to the entrance, head bowed. A handkerchief pressed to his mouth came away spotted with blood. The room smelled of whiskey, expensive tobacco, and something else, the medicinal odor of illness poorly disguised. Abigail hesitated. Her original plan had been to search the office while Blackwood was at the bank. Instead, he sat mere feet away, separated only by the thin barrier of a half-open door. She should retreat, find another way, another time. But there would be no other time. By nightfall, Blackwood's men would ride on the Ridge Ranch. By tomorrow, everything would change, one way or another. Gathering her courage, she pushed the door open wider and stepped into the study. "Hello, Father." Blackwood turned sharply, surprise transforming his gaunt features. For a long moment, he simply stared, as if unable to process her presence or her words. "You know," he finally said, voice rough from coughing. "I know." Abigail remained by the door, ready to flee if necessary. "Mother left a letter and evidence." A bitter smile twisted Blackwood's lips. "Sarah was always thorough. I suppose she documented my wartime activities as well?" "Every transaction, every betrayal." Blackwood nodded slowly, unsurprised. "And now you've come to what? Blackmail me? Expose me?" His yellow-tinged eyes assessed her with new calculation. "Or perhaps to claim your birthright?" "I want the truth," Abigail said, taking a step forward. "About the mine, about the contaminated water, about Elizabeth Ridge and the other children who died because of your greed." Something dangerous flickered in Blackwood's expression. "Ah, so you're here at Ridge's proxy, not as my daughter at all." He rose from his chair, moving with the deliberate care of a man in constant pain. "Did he tell you I let his precious Elizabeth die? Did he make me the villain in his tragedy? You detained him the night she took a turn for the worse." "Business," Blackwood said dismissively. "The loan payment was legitimately due. I had no way of knowing his daughter's condition had deteriorated. And the water contamination? The heavy metals from your mine poisoning the aquifer?" At this, Blackwood's facade cracked slightly. "An unfortunate side effect of progress. Mining is a dirty business, girl, always has been." He moved to a cabinet and poured himself another drink, hand trembling noticeably. "Besides, the connection was never proven. Ridge has proof. Water samples, illness patterns, geological surveys. Circumstantial." Blackwood waved a dismissive hand, though tension had entered his posture. "No court would convict on such evidence. And in case you've forgotten, I own the courts in redemption." Abigail took another step forward. "There's a U.S. Marshal on his way from Helena. Federal charges don't answer to local influences." This news seemed to land with more impact. Blackwood sank back into his chair, sudden weariness overtaking him. "What do you want, Abigail? Money? Recognition? To see me in prison before this?" He gestured to his sickly appearance. "Finishes what it started?" "I want you to make it right," Abigail said simply. "Confess to the contamination. Pay restitution to the families. Acknowledge me publicly." She paused, then added more softly, "Give yourself a chance at redemption before it's too late." Blackwood studied her face, seeing perhaps for the first time the echoes of Sarah in her features. Something almost like regret crossed his expression. "You have her moral certainty," he said finally, "her unflinching sense of right and wrong." He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "I loved her, you know, in my way. Not enough to marry her, not enough to claim your own child. No." The admission came without defensiveness. "I was a coward in that regard, afraid of social consequences, of what people would say. By the time I realized my mistake, Sarah had taken you away. Pride kept me from searching for you both." A bitter smile. "And then she died, and you appeared at my doorstep, looking for work. The universe's idea of a joke, perhaps." Abigail absorbed this, the confirmation of what she had begun to suspect. "You knew who I was all along, yet you kept me as a servant. I wasn't sure at first. Then I saw the medallion you kept hidden, the one I'd given Sarah. After that, I watched you, looking for more proof." Blackwood's gaze grew distant. "You have my chin, my hands, but everything else, the best parts, those are all Sarah. Why accuse me of theft? Why drive me away? Because you were getting too close to things you shouldn't know." His eyes sharpened. "The ledgers. You found them, didn't you? That's why you're really here." Abigail didn't deny it. "I need those records. They prove you knew about the contamination and covered it up." Blackwood laughed, a sound that dissolved into another coughing fit. When he recovered, he gestured toward a painting on the far wall, a landscape of the Montana Territory in summer. Behind it, he said resignedly. A wall safe. Combination is 183624. Surprised by his cooperation, Abigail hesitated, suspecting a trap. Blackwood seemed to read her thoughts. No tricks, Abigail. What's the point now? The mine is failing. I'm dying from the very poison I released. And tomorrow, one way or another, everything changes. He looked suddenly tired, the weight of his sins visible in the slump of his shoulders. Take what you came for. Still wary, Abigail moved to the painting and removed it from the wall. The safe behind it was small but well made. She dialed in the combination, hearing the tumblers click into place. Inside lay several leather-bound ledgers and a stack of documents. As she reached for them, Blackwood spoke again. A question before you go. If I had acknowledged you, claimed you as my daughter when you first came to work here, what would you have done? Abigail paused, considering. I would have been shocked. Angry, probably, but also relieved, Blackwood finished for her. To know you weren't alone in the world after all. Something like genuine regret crossed his features. Another mistake to add to my considerable list. Abigail gathered the ledgers, securing them in a satchel she found nearby. It's not too late, she said, surprising herself with the words. Come to the town meeting tomorrow. Tell the truth. It won't undo the past, but it might help those still suffering. Blackwood watched her, his expression unreadable. You should go. My men will be returning soon. Abigail moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. Call off the riders heading to Ridge Ranch tonight. A flicker of surprise crossed Blackwood's face. What riders? The men you've hired to form a posse, to arrest me or worse. Blackwood frowned. I've hired no posse. Why would I when I knew you'd come to me eventually? His eyes narrowed. Who told you this? Sam Thornton. He rode to the ranch this morning with the warning. Thornton. Blackwood spat the name like a curse. That interfering fool has been stirring trouble for weeks. Claiming his daughter's illness came from my mind, demanding compensation. A chill ran through Abigail as pieces fell into place. If you didn't send riders, then who? The front door burst open with a crash. Heavy footsteps pounded in the entrance hall. Blackwood rose unsteadily, alarm replacing his previous resignation. Go, he urged, suddenly urgent. Through the side door. Now! Abigail clutched the satchel of evidence to her chest, frozen in indecision. Before she could move, the study door flew open. Sam Thornton stood in the doorway, a rifle in his hands, hatred twisting his normally pleasant features. Found her, he called over his shoulder. With Blackwood, just like I said. More men crowded the hallway behind him. Miners and farmers, their faces set in the righteous anger of vigilante justice. Thornton, what is the meaning of this? Blackwood demanded, drawing himself up with the authority of his position. Justice, Thornton replied coldly. For my Emma. For all our children, he gestured with the rifle. The girl first for helping you cover it up. Then you. Abigail backed away, bumping into Blackwood's desk. Mr. Thornton, please. We have evidence. The U.S. Marshal is coming. There will be a proper trial. No more waiting, Thornton said. No more sick children while the law takes its time. He raised the rifle, aiming at Abigail. The half-breed first. Poetic, really. Your kind brought the sickness that's killing our children. Blackwood moved with surprising speed for a dying man, positioning himself between Abigail and the rifle. She's my daughter, he declared, voice ringing with authority. My blood. Touch her, and I'll see each of you hang. A murmur of shock ran through the assembled men. Thornton hesitated, the rifle barrel wavering. He's lying, someone called from the back, trying to protect his servant. No, Blackwood said firmly. Abigail is my daughter by Sarah Nighthawk. I've never acknowledged her publicly, to my shame, but I acknowledge her now. He straightened his shoulders, summoning the commanding presence that had dominated redemption for decades. Any man who harms her answers to me and the full extent of my remaining power. The standoff stretched, tension thick in the air. Then, from the rear of the group, a new voice cut through the silence. Put down the weapons, now. Sheriff Davies pushed through the crowd, his deputy beside him. Behind them came Jackson Ridge, his expression thunderous. This isn't a legal posse, Davies announced. It's a lynch mob, and I won't have it in my town. Your town, Thornton laughed bitterly. It's his town. He jerked his head toward Blackwood. Always has been. and he's been poisoning us for years. There will be a reckoning, Jackson said, stepping forward, but through law, not murder. His eyes met Abigail's, relief evident in their depths. Are you all right? She nodded, still clutching the evidence satchel. This ends now, Davies insisted, hand on his holstered gun. Drop the weapons and disperse, or face charges of attempted murder and insurrection. For a moment, it seemed Thornton might resist. Then slowly, he lowered the rifle. This isn't over, he warned. The truth will come out, one way or another. Yes, Jackson agreed, it will, at tomorrow's town meeting, with all evidence presented properly. As Davies and his deputy began clearing the house, Jackson moved to Abigail's side. I thought we agreed you'd be careful, he said softly. Plans changed, she replied, indicating the satchel. I got what we needed, and she glanced at Blackwood, who had sunk back into his chair, energy spent. Something I didn't expect. Jackson followed her gaze, noting the protective stance Blackwood had taken before the mob. Understanding dawned in his eyes. He acknowledged you. When it mattered most, Abigail confirmed, though it changes nothing about what he's done. Blackwood looked up, meeting Jackson's gaze with unexpected directness. Ridge, he said, voice weak but determined. A word if you would. Jackson hesitated, decades of enmity not easily set aside, but eventually he nodded. Abigail, wait outside with the sheriff. I'll join you shortly. As Abigail left the study, she glanced back to see the two men, her biological father and the man who had saved both her and her mother, facing each other across the gulf of their shared and separate tragedies. Outside, the winter sun had begun its early descent, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Sheriff Davies stood on the porch, watching as Thornton and his followers reluctantly dispersed. That was too close, he said as Abigail joined him. Thornton's been half mad since his daughter fell ill. Been telling anyone who'd listen that Blackwood's mine poisoned the water. It did, Abigail said simply. We have proof. Davies sighed heavily. I suspected as much. But suspecting and proving are different matters, especially when a man like Blackwood holds all the power. He gave her a sidelong glance. Or held it anyway. His grip's been slipping lately. You knew about me? That I'm his daughter? Had my suspicions. Davies removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair. You favor your mother, but there's enough of him in you to notice if a man's paying attention. Abigail absorbed this. How many others had guessed the truth she herself had only just discovered? What happens now, she asked. Now we prepare for tomorrow's town meeting. Marshal Collins should arrive by morning. With federal authority behind us, even Blackwood's influence can't stop the truth from coming out. Inside the house, raised voices briefly echoed from the study. Jackson's deeper tone followed by Blackwood's weaker response. Then silence. Minutes later, Jackson emerged, his expression troubled. Let's go, he said to Abigail, taking the evidence satchel from her hands. We've done what we came to do. What did he say to you? She asked as they descended the mansion's front steps. Jackson didn't answer immediately, guiding her toward where their horses waited. Only when they were some distance from the house did he speak. He asked for my forgiveness. Abigail's step faltered. For Elizabeth? For all of it. The contamination, the cover-up, the lives lost. Jackson's voice was tight with suppressed emotion. He claims he didn't know at first, that the mine was poisoning the water. When he figured it out, it was too late to stop with the financial ruin. Do you believe him? That he didn't know initially? Perhaps. That he chose profit over people once he did know? Absolutely. Jackson's jaw tightened. Some things can't be forgiven, Abigail. Not in this life. They collected their horses from the livery stable and rode toward the small white church at the edge of town. Reverend Howard, a lean man with kind eyes, welcomed them inside. Fletcher is waiting in the back room, he informed them, with another visitor. The marshal arrived early. Relief washed over Jackson's features. Thank God for small mercies. The back room of the church served as both office and living quarters for the minister. Fletcher sat at a small table across from a tall man in a dust-covered federal marshal's uniform. Both rose as Jackson and Abigail entered. Ridge, Marshal Collins said, extending a hand. Been too many years. Collins, Jackson clasped the offered hand. Thank you for coming. Couldn't refuse after what Fletcher here told me. The marshal's weathered face turned to Abigail. And this must be Sarah Nighthawk's girl. The resemblance is striking. Abigail blinked in surprise. You knew my mother? Worked with her during the war. Intelligence gathering. Collins smiled slightly. Your mother saved my life more than once with her quick thinking and quicker writing. Fletcher cleared his throat. The evidence? Jackson placed the satchel on the table. Blackwood's private ledgers, records of water testing, illness reports among workers, false statements to investors. He looked to Abigail, and he confirmed everything, to her face. Marshal Collins nodded with satisfaction. That, combined with what Fletcher brought from the cabin and your research, should be more than enough for federal charges. He began examining the documents methodically. Environmental contamination, fraud, wartime profiteering. Blackwood will spend what remains of his life behind bars. If he lives that long, Fletcher murmured, looked half dead already. A sudden thought struck Abigail. What about the town meeting tomorrow? Should we still present everything publicly? Absolutely, Collins confirmed. This isn't just about prosecuting one man. It's about bringing the truth to light for an entire community. People deserve to know what happened to their children, their families. Night had fallen by the time they finished reviewing the evidence. Reverend Howard provided a simple meal and offered beds for all of them. The church's sanctuary, he said, no violence has ever occurred within these walls, and none will tonight. As the others settled in for the night, Abigail found herself unable to sleep. She slipped outside, wrapping a borrowed shawl around her shoulders against the bitter cold. The sky above Redemption blazed with stars, their light intensified by the crystalline winter air. Footsteps crunched in the snow behind her. Jackson joined her on the church steps, offering a steaming cup. Couldn't sleep either, he said. Abigail accepted the cup gratefully, letting the warmth seep into her cold fingers. Everything changes tomorrow. Yes. They sat in companionable silence for a time, each lost in private thoughts. Finally, Abigail asked the question that had been haunting her since leaving Blackwood's mansion. When this is over, what happens to me? Jackson turned to her, surprised. What do you want to happen? I don't know. She stared into her cup. I've spent so long just trying to survive, I never thought beyond that. A pause. Blackwood is my father, but after tomorrow, he'll be a convicted criminal. I have no other family, no home, no place in this world. You have a place, Jackson said quietly. If you want it, at the ranch, not as a servant or a guest, but as... He hesitated, seeming to search for the right words. As family, he finished simply. Abigail looked up, startled by the offer and the emotion behind it. Why would you want that, after everything Blackwood did to your daughter? You are not your father, Abigail. You're Sarah's daughter. The woman who saved countless lives during the war, including your own. Jackson's voice softened. And you're yourself, brave, intelligent, resilient. The ranch has been empty for too long. Tears pricked at Abigail's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them away, focusing on the stars overhead. I'd like that, she whispered. Jackson nodded, satisfaction evident in his profile. Good. That's settled then. They remained on the church steps a while longer, sharing silence and starlight, until the cold finally drove them inside. Neither knew that as they sought sleep, events were already in motion that would test their newfound bond in ways they couldn't anticipate. Dawn broke with a distant rumble of thunder, unusual for a Montana winter. Marshal Collins was the first to recognize it for what it was. Dynamite, he said grimly, buckling on his gun belt. Coming from the direction of the mine. They rushed outside to see a plume of smoke rising from the mountains east of town. People emerged from their homes and businesses, pointing and speculating. Sheriff Davies rode up, his horse lathered despite the cold. Blackwood's gone, he announced without preamble. Rode out before first light with a wagon full of explosives. Left this for you. He handed Jackson a sealed envelope. Inside was a single page of Blackwood's elegant handwriting. Ridge, by the time you read this, I will have done what should have been done years ago. The contaminated shaft will be sealed permanently, buried under thousands of tons of rock. It won't undo the damage already done, but it will prevent further harm. I know this gesture comes too late for forgiveness. I don't ask for it, but I do ask one thing. Look after Abigail. She deserves better than either of us gave her. You with your distant protection, me with my cowardly denial. She is the best of Sarah, and perhaps the only worthwhile thing I leave behind. The truth will out tomorrow, regardless. I've left signed confessions with my lawyer, but I choose how my story ends. Victor Blackwood Jackson passed the letter to Marshal Collins, who read it with a deepening frown. Damn fool, the marshal muttered, trying for a noble exit. Or destroying evidence, Fletcher suggested. Either way, we need to get up there, Jackson decided. If he's still alive, he needs to face justice properly. They rode hard toward the mine, a grim procession. Jackson, Abigail, Marshal Collins, and Sheriff Davies. The morning air grew thick with dust and smoke as they approached, visibility decreasing with each mile. The scene that greeted them at the mine entrance was one of controlled chaos. Miners streamed from the shaft, coughing and dust-covered. Support buildings had partially collapsed from the force of the explosion. And at the main entrance, a massive cave-in had sealed the tunnel completely. He's still inside, a foreman reported when questioned. Rode in just after dawn, ordered everyone out, said he was doing a final inspection. 20 minutes later, boom. The man shook his head in disbelief. Whole mountainside came down. Marshal Collins surveyed the damage with a professional eye. No getting through that, not for weeks, maybe months. Could he have survived? Abigail asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil evident in her expression. Not a chance, the foreman replied. He was near the contaminated shaft when it blew. That's where the worst damage is. Jackson watched Abigail carefully, trying to gauge her reaction to her father's apparent suicide. Her face revealed little, but her knuckles had whitened where she gripped her horse's reins. We still have the evidence, Collins reminded them, and apparently more confessions waiting with his lawyer. The truth will still come out. But without him to face it, Jackson observed. Perhaps that's his final act of cowardice, Abigail said softly. Or perhaps his only possible redemption. They returned to town in somber procession. Word of Blackwood's fate spread quickly, reactions ranging from shock to vindication. By midday, a strange quiet had settled over redemption, a community holding its collective breath, waiting for the reckoning that would come with the evening's town meeting. Blackwood's lawyer, a thin man named Hargrove, appeared at the church shortly after noon, carrying a leather portfolio. These were to be delivered in the event of Mr. Blackwood's death, he explained, handing the documents to Marshal Collins. He updated his will last night and included this confession, fully notarized. The confession was comprehensive, detailing the discovery of contamination, the decision to conceal it, the falsified records. It explicitly absolved the mine workers and other employees of any knowledge or responsibility, and it acknowledged Abigail as his legitimate daughter and heir to his estate. He left everything to you, Hargrove informed Abigail, clearly uncomfortable with this development. The house, his remaining interests in the mine and bank, all assets, with some specific bequests for restitution to affected families. Abigail received this news with visible shock. I don't want his money. Nevertheless, it's legally yours. The lawyer adjusted his spectacles nervously. The will is ironclad. He had me draw it up years ago after your mother died, though your name was added only recently. A pause. He always intended to acknowledge you, Miss Abigail. He simply waited too long. After Hargrove departed, Abigail sat in stunned silence, the implications of her sudden inheritance washing over her. Jackson watched her with concern. You don't have to accept it, he said gently. If I don't, who gets it? His wife died years ago. There are no other children. She looked up, resolution forming in her eyes. The money should go to those he harmed, to the families of the children who died, the workers who fell ill. Marshal Collins nodded approvingly. A trust could be established, with independent oversight. And the house? Fletcher asked practically. Abigail considered this. A hospital, perhaps, or a school. Her expression softened with memory. My mother always wanted to establish a proper school for children of mixed heritage, where they wouldn't be treated as less than. Sarah's school, Jackson murmured. She would like that. As afternoon faded toward evening, people began gathering at the town hall. Word had spread that revelations about Blackwood and the mine would be presented. Despite the bitter cold, it seemed the entire population of Redemption had turned out. Miners and merchants, ranchers and laborers, the wealthy and the struggling. Jackson, Abigail, and Marshal Collins entered to a hushed hall. Sheriff Davies stood at the front, attempting to maintain order as speculation buzzed through the crowd. At the marshal's appearance, a reverent silence fell. The presentation of evidence was methodical and irrefutable. Water samples, medical records, Blackwood's private ledgers, and finally his signed confession, all painting a damning picture of corporate greed and callous disregard for human life. When the extent of the contamination became clear, gasps and angry murmurs rippled through the audience. Mothers who had lost children to mysterious fevers wept openly. Miners exchanged dark glances, connecting their persistent ailments to their employment. Through it all, Abigail sat quietly beside Jackson, her face a mask of composure. Only the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her emotional turmoil. Discovering her father's greatest sins and his death on the same day, becoming heir to both his fortune and his infamy. Near the end of the presentation, Marshal Collins addressed the issue of Blackwood's death directly. Victor Blackwood chose to seal the contaminated shaft permanently, at the cost of his own life. While this may appear as a final act of responsibility, it does not erase the damage done, nor does it absolve him of his crimes. He surveyed the room. However, his final act has provided for restitution. His entire estate will be used to compensate affected families and fund medical care for those suffering from the contamination. A murmur of surprise ran through the crowd. Additionally, Collins continued, I am authorized to announce that the estate will establish a school for children of all backgrounds, to be named in honor of Sarah Nighthawk, a Cherokee nurse who served this country valiantly during the Civil War. At this point, an elderly man at the back of the hall rose shakily to his feet. His copper skin and traditional clothing marked him as Native American. Two wolves who had traveled down from the mountains to witness this day. Sarah Nighthawk was my niece, he announced, his voice carrying surprising strength. She would be pleased to see justice done, however late it comes. And she would be proud of her daughter, who stands before you now, Abigail, daughter of Sarah Nighthawk and Victor Blackwood. All eyes turned to Abigail. She rose slowly, the weight of the moment visible in her bearing. I never knew my father until recently, she said, her voice steady. I worked in his house for years as a servant, unacknowledged. But in his final days, he recognized his mistakes. Too late for many, including Dr. Ridge's daughter Elizabeth. She glanced at Jackson, drawing strength from his supportive nod. I cannot undo what he did, but I can try to use his legacy to heal rather than harm. The school will be open to all children, regardless of heritage or wealth. The trust will provide for those who have suffered, and the contaminated water sources will be properly treated and monitored. She paused, gathering herself for her final words. My mother taught me that we are not defined by our blood alone, but by our choices. Victor Blackwood made terrible choices for most of his life. In the end, he tried to make one better one. It doesn't balance the scales, but perhaps it gives us all a path forward. A profound silence followed her speech. Then, from the front row, a woman stood, Mrs. Thornton, whose daughter Emma had recently recovered from fever under Jackson's care. I lost my first child to the sickness from that mine, she said, voice thick with emotion, and nearly lost Emma too. I've carried hate in my heart for years, not knowing where to direct it. She looked directly at Abigail. I don't know if I can forgive what was done, but I'm willing to try to build something better from it. One by one, others rose, parents who had lost children, miners who had fallen ill, townspeople whose lives had been touched by Blackwood's negligence. Each expressed their grief, their anger, but also cautious hope for healing. By the time the meeting concluded, something had shifted in Redemption, a town beginning the long process of confronting its wounds and finding a path toward recovery. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting down to cover the day's tracks. Jackson, Abigail, and Fletcher prepared their horses for the return journey to the ranch. You did well in there, Jackson told Abigail quietly. Elizabeth would have liked you. She had the same sense of justice. Abigail smiled faintly. I think I would have liked her too. After a moment, she added, I meant what I said about the offer to stay at the ranch still standing, if you want it. I do, she said simply. It feels right, somehow, like completing a circle. As they rode through the gathering dusk, the snow thickened, transforming the landscape into a blank canvas awaiting new impressions. They were nearly home when Abigail broke the companionable silence. I've been thinking about the locked room, Elizabeth's room, with all your research. Jackson glanced at her, questioning. Perhaps it's time to use it differently, not as a shrine or a laboratory, but as something new, a place of learning maybe, where you could teach medicine to those who need it. Jackson was quiet for so long that Abigail feared she had overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I think Elizabeth would approve of that. The ranch appeared through the swirling snow, windows glowing with welcoming light. Fletcher had ridden ahead to prepare for their arrival, and smoke rose invitingly from the chimney. As they stabled their horses and stomped snow from their boots, Jackson paused at the porch steps, looking back toward the mountains now hidden in darkness and falling snow. Tomorrow we'll ride up to the cemetery on the ridge, he said. I think it's time you met Elizabeth properly, and perhaps we could place a marker for your mother as well. Abigail's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. I'd like that. Inside, the house felt different already, warmer somehow, despite the bitter cold outside. The ghost that had haunted its rooms for 7 years seemed less oppressive, the shadows less deep. That night, as Abigail settled into her room, no longer a guest room, but her room, she placed her mother's medallion on the bedside table beside the small photograph of Elizabeth that Jackson had given her. Two legacies, different but equally important, to guide whatever came next. Spring arrived late to Montana, the snow reluctantly surrendering to warming temperatures and lengthening days. The meadow behind the Ridge Ranch exploded with wildflowers, lupines painting the landscape in swaths of purple and blue. On a hill overlooking the meadow stood the small family cemetery. Two grave markers caught the morning light. Elizabeth's, weathered by years of Montana seasons, and a newer one beside it. Sarah Nighthawk, healer and mother, never forgotten. Abigail knelt between them, placing fresh lupines at each stone. The past months had brought changes both subtle and profound. The locked room had been transformed into a teaching space, where Jackson had begun instructing her and several others in medical practices that combined his surgical knowledge with traditional healing methods. In Redemption, the grand house on the hill now served as both school and hospital, fulfilling Sarah's dream and addressing the town's needs. The contaminated water sources had been identified and contained, the affected families compensated from Blackwood's considerable estate. And at the ranch, life had found a new rhythm, one that acknowledged the past without being imprisoned by it. Jackson rarely spoke of Elizabeth or Caroline, but he no longer avoided their memory. Fletcher had softened his initial wariness into gruff affection, teaching Abigail the practical skills of ranch management with surprising patience. The sound of approaching footsteps drew Abigail's attention. Jackson climbed the hill, moving more easily than when she'd first met him. The burden of grief and guilt had not disappeared, but it had lightened enough to allow him to stand straighter, to look forward more than back. Ready? He asked, stopping beside her. The new patients will be arriving soon. Abigail nodded, rising to her feet. Together they surveyed the land below, the ranch, the distant town, the mountains beyond. Winter had tried to claim her once, but love had proved stronger than cold, and family had been built not by blood, but by choice. Sarah would be proud of you, Jackson said quietly, as would Elizabeth, I think. Abigail touched the medallion at her throat, the symbol of her dual heritage that she now wore openly. And you, are you proud of what we've built? Jackson considered this, his gaze taking in the purple sea of lupines beneath the wide Montana sky. Yes, he said finally, I believe I am. Side by side, healer and apprentice, surrogate father and found daughter, they descended the hill toward the waiting ranch house, a home reclaimed from grief and secrets, now filled with purpose and possibility. Behind them, the wildflowers nodded in the spring breeze, nature's testimony to renewal after the longest winter. Spring arrived late to Montana, the snow reluctantly surrendering to warming temperatures and lengthening days. The meadow behind the Ridge Ranch exploded with wildflowers, lupines painting the landscape in swaths of purple and blue. On a hill overlooking the meadow stood the small family cemetery. Two grave markers caught the morning light. Elizabeth's, weathered by years of Montana seasons, and a newer one beside it. Sarah Nighthawk, healer and mother never forgotten. Abigail knelt between them, placing fresh lupines at each stone. The past months had brought changes both subtle and profound. The locked room had been transformed into a teaching space, where Jackson had begun instructing her and several others in medical practices that combined his surgical knowledge with traditional healing methods. In Redemption, the grand house on the hill now served as both school and hospital, fulfilling Sarah's dream and addressing the town's needs. Children of settlers and native families learned side by side in classrooms once reserved for Blackwood's lavish parties. Among them was Emma Thornton, fully recovered and eager to learn Abigail's plant medicine, as she called it. The contaminated water sources had been identified and contained. The affected families compensated from Blackwood's considerable estate. A new well system, designed with both modern engineering and traditional knowledge of water sources, now served the town and surrounding homesteads. Once a month, two wolves came down from the mountains to sit with the children, sharing stories that bridged cultures. The elderly Cherokee had become a respected figure in Redemption, his wisdom sought by townspeople who had once looked away when he passed. And at the ranch, life had found a new rhythm, one that acknowledged the past without being imprisoned by it. Jackson rarely spoke of Elizabeth or Caroline, but he no longer avoided their memory. Fletcher had softened his initial wariness into gruff affection, teaching Abigail the practical skills of ranch management with surprising patience. Sunday dinners at the Ridge Ranch had become a tradition. Fletcher at one end of the table, Jackson at the other, with Abigail and a rotating cast of patients, students, and neighbors filling the spaces between. Laughter now echoed in rooms long haunted by silence. The sound of approaching footsteps drew Abigail's attention. Jackson climbed the hill, moving more easily than when she'd first met him. The burden of grief and guilt had not disappeared, but it had lightened enough to allow him to stand straighter, to look forward more than back. "Ready?" he asked, stopping beside Hero. "The new patients will be arriving soon." Abigail nodded, rising to her feet. Jackson's gaze lingered on Caroline's name, etched smaller beneath Elizabeth's on the family marker. "She wrote to me last month," he said quietly, "from San Francisco." Abigail looked up in surprise. "Your wife?" "Ex-wife," Jackson corrected gently. "She's remarried, has a stepdaughter." A small smile touched his lips. "She's glad to know Elizabeth's room is filled with learning again. Said it would have made her happy." Together they surveyed the land below, the ranch, the distant town, the mountains beyond. Winter had tried to claim her once, but love had proved stronger than cold, and family had been built not by blood, but by choice, Dirk. "Sarah would be proud of you," Jackson said quietly. "As would Elizabeth, I think." Abigail touched the medallion at her throat, the symbol of her dual heritage that she now wore openly. "And you, are you proud of what we've built?" Jackson considered this, his gaze taking in the purple sea of lupines beneath the wide Montana sky. "Yes," he said finally. "I believe I am." Side by side, healer and apprentice, surrogate father and found daughter, they descended the hill toward the waiting ranch house. Through the open windows came the sound of Fletcher's good-natured grumbling as he prepared for the day's visitors, the scent of coffee and baking bread wafting on the spring air. On the porch sat Sam Thornton, hat in hands, waiting patiently for his regular checkup, the poison in his system gradually giving way to Jackson and Abigail's combined treatments. Beside him, his daughter Emma chatted eagerly with a Cherokee boy around her age, their differences forgotten in the enthusiasm of childhood. Inside, the shelves held medical texts alongside Cherokee healing traditions, written down at last with Abigail's careful hand. Caroline's silver hairbrush now sat on Abigail's dresser, gifted across the miles with a note, "For my husband's new daughter. Elizabeth would have loved a sister." The home, once imprisoned by grief, now opened its doors to all who needed healing. And in that opening, the Ridge family, unconventional, unexpected, and unbreakable, had found their own healing too. Behind them, the wildflowers nodded in the spring breeze, nature's testimony to renewal after the longest winter. The mountains stood as they always had, bearing witness to pain and joy alike, to endings that became beginnings, and to love that, like the lupines, returned with each new season, more abundant than before.